जो सदैव शक्ति और अहिंसा की राह पर चलता रहा। आज संपूर्ण विश्व जिसके सम्मुख नतमस्तक है, महात्मा गांधी।
चले तो 3 विकेट तो गिर चुका, अभी देखते हैं कहाँ गिरेगा।
Welcome to this edition of Public Forum. I'm Shalini Verma. Indian economy, which is Asia's third largest economy, is now worth $1.3 trillion. It is the second fastest growing major economy after China. And together, they are about to reset the new world order. Year 2010 has been a major contributor to India's growth story. In today's Public Forum, we do a reality check on the pink view of the Indian economy. And to discuss more on this, we are joined by Mr. Priyaranjan Das. He's the managing editor with Financial Chronicle. Dr. Upendra Das, senior fellow with the Research and Information System for Developing Countries. And Dr. Amitabh Kundu, professor of economics, Center for Study of Regional Development, JNU. But before we begin the discussion, let us take a quick look at the state of Indian economy in the year 2010. This year was a mixed year for the Indian economy with a fair share of ahs and alas. The GDP growth remained consistently at 8.9% as compared to last year. The industrial production showed an average growth of 10.8% in manufacturing sector, a reduction in electricity production, but the mining sector registered a slight growth as compared to last year. According to the fourth advanced estimates, rice production decreased by 10% in 2009 and 10 as compared to the previous year, whereas wheat production growth registered a pathetic 0.4% rise. Inflation figures based on wholesale price index were higher in November 2010, while the consumer price index figures remained lower than those of last year. The value of rupee per US dollar declined by approximately 1% in 2010, whereas its value per euro decreased by around 8% this year. Foreign trade remained on a considerably good growth track. with both imports and exports registering a growth of nearly 26% from April to October this year. Bureau Report, Lok Sabha Television. Right, it's known as the one of the fastest growing economies, and these figures that you saw were basically based on the website of the Ministry of Finance and RBI. But let us now begin with the discussion here. Mr. Dash, to begin with, how do we look at the India's economy's response to the slowdown and the way we have revived from the slowdown and this year, 2010?
The recovery has been very fast compared to other economies of the world. Even today, most of the advanced economies, the recovery there is very weak and feeble. India wasn't that hard impacted by the global financial and economic crisis, but even then it had got the growth trajectory that it was traveling at 9% plus. It got derailed, and now it is firmly back on track. That's what it seems. So the recovery has been really fast.
It was important to achieve the growth with development agenda that the government also came up with, and probably 2010 was the year when the performance of the government was to be evaluated. Dr. Kundu, how do you look at the entire concept of inclusive growth, and how do you look at the sectors, the various sectors' performance?
You see, not only that, as Dr. Das mentioned, India had the shortest turnaround period from global crisis. But in terms of inclusiveness, what we notice is that the regional inequality in growth has also gone down. If not only just the year 2009-10, but if you look at the overall growth performance for the last 5 to 6 years, we are in this high growth trajectory, 8% plus. Not only that, our regional disparities have gone down, and also what is more important, that at macro level, poverty figures also have gone down, no matter how we measure it. The way Planning Commission defines poverty, certainly by that, India is making progress not only in terms of the overall macro growth, but also in terms of in terms of regional inequality. We have bridged the gap to a certain extent, and poverty has also gone down. But only the concern is poverty has shifted from large cities and the state capitals and the surrounding immediate areas to distant localities, to the areas where tribal populations live. It has got concentrated among scheduled caste population, Muslim population, where poverty eradication in future years is going to be much more difficult. So macro level poverty has gone down, but certainly poverty has got concentrated and deepened in certain remote areas, elite tracts, tribal areas.
Okay, a huge concern there around the poverty issue, but what is your view, Dr. Das, on the performance of our economy this year?
Well, as the two panelists mentioned, I would say that given the context in which we entered into this year, the performance has been really remarkable, especially if you see the figures that we have between April and October. The most enlightening part was that agriculture registered 4.4% growth in Q2. And manufacturing, definitely as compared to earlier phases, it's a little lower, but it's still registering a high growth. And services also complementing. Now, if you combine all these three, and if you combine what Professor Kundu just mentioned, that the inequalities, both in terms of region and in terms of income, both have gone down. I would say it augurs very well for the future, because if we can perform this way in the context of almost global liquidity crunch and meltdown, I would be very optimistic, and I would say it was fantastic.
Okay, the very crucial sector that you talked about, agriculture sector. Dr. Kundu, once again, let us now talk about the big surprise sector this time, the crucial agricultural sector. Last year, the growth that was registered in this sector was merely some 0.2%, but this time in the first quarter and the second quarter, the figures were 2.5% and 4.4% respectively. How do you think has it really contributed in the booming of the economy, and how is it really going to benefit the economy now?
Certainly, agriculture is a very crucial sector. It may have just 16% of the share in the total economy, and its improvement in its growth may not contribute to the macroeconomic growth becoming very high. But certainly, agricultural growth has implication for poverty reduction. Large percentage, even 52% of our population today are dependent on agriculture. That's why it is not only from the growth perspective, from equity perspective, agricultural sector's performance is very important. And by the way, agriculture has done extremely badly in the early years of the present decade.
Right.
Even last year it was bad. Only the first year of 11 5-year plan, the growth rate was 4%. We hope that this year it will be so. For 2 consecutive years, growth have not been there.
What are the reasons for this good performance now? We're not talking about the bad performance here.
Well, I believe, firstly, that Narega has done something in terms of infrastructure creation. And I looked at the migration statistics. Just it has been released from National Sample Survey Organization. We find that migration rate has slowed down from the depressed areas, which really means that there are employment generation which has taken place.
Mr. Dash, what is your view on this agriculture sector performance?
See, agriculture sector performance this year is because of the bad year last year. Last year was a bad base. So on that, actually the growth that we are seeing today, the data so far available for the first 2 quarters, that's going to be substantially revised because if you look at take the historical data, then in fact every bad drought year has the following year has been an excellent crop year, and not only has it contributed to a very high agricultural growth, but overall GDP, overall economic growth has also been very high. The only time you've crossed 10% growth has been in a year that has followed the bad drought year in the 80s. So this year, in fact, the kind of overall economic growth, the GDP growth that we have seen in the first 2 quarters, near about 9%, could in fact be getting revised to a double-digit kind of a growth.
Also, you mentioned
because of the low base. So this year's agricultural performance, I do not think there's been anything dramatic that has happened on the ground that is created this kind of.
It's just that because last year the performance
was bad, so this year it is. But what last year's growth also showed was that, or last year was a stagnation. There was actually with that kind of a drought, our agriculture would have suffered a very severe production loss, which wasn't the case last year. In fact, in that there is something one can see in terms of the infrastructure, etc., that might have gone into agriculture, which has made agriculture to an extent drought resistant. To the extent that in a drought year like it was the case last year, we would have had much more sharp fall in production, which was served because perhaps agricultural sector there's been some improvement somewhere.
But another crucial sector here is also the industry, especially the manufacturing sector. How do you look at its performance?
See, the manufacturing sector, if you look at it in comparison to last year and the year before that, it's been the manufacturing sector growth has been driven by demand, and that is consumer demand, be it automobile or mobile phones or you just name it, two-wheelers, those kind of products which have been driving the manufacturing sector growth. Obviously, there was a demand squeeze in the years of the slowdown. To an extent, the government stimulus package, including things like the Narega in the rural areas, or even the farm loan waiver, or the 6th pay commission for the for the central government staff, in
Right.
fact, for all government staff. Those things to an extent contributed to creating the demand, but overall consumer demand did suffer.
Dr.
Now
Das,
there has been a recovery of that consumer demand, which
Right.
is being seen in the manufacturing sector.
Dr. Das, we'll also take a quick comment from you on the performance of these two sectors. What is your opinion?
You see, I don't want to amplify one facet of agricultural sector growth, but it is there. When we talk of price rise, and especially, food and, cereals prices, rising, this price rise actually also translates into greater income in
Right.
the agricultural sector, which
Okay.
gets translated into agricultural, GDP.
I think that's a very crucial point. We'll come to that. Time for a very short break here in Public Forum. Stay tuned.
बहन जी, रोशनी की माँ और पिता आए हैं।
जी नमस्ते।
नमस्ते। रोशनी की पढ़ाई अच्छी चल रही है। आजकल मैं उसे गणित में जोड़ और घटाने के सवालों का खूब अभ्यास करा रही हूँ। बहन जी, सवाल हो गए। रोशनी की कॉपी तो देखिए, कल 10 में से 8 सवाल ठीक थे। आज सारे 10 के 10 ठीक हैं। शाबाश रोशनी। शाबाश रोशनी।
रुक जा यार।
देखा आपने, आपकी छोटी सी नादानी से कितने लोग परेशान होते हैं। हम सबको अपने अधिकारों की रक्षा के साथ साथ अपने कर्तव्यों का निर्वाह भी करना चाहिए।
हर महीने वृद्धावस्था पेंशन मेरा सम्मान।
हर महीने विधवा पेंशन मेरी जरूरत।
हर महीने विकलांगता पेंशन मेरा सहारा।
65 वर्ष या अधिक आयु के बुजुर्ग, 40 से 64 वर्ष की विधवाएं, 18 से 64 वर्ष की विकलांग जो गरीबी रेखा से नीचे हों, हर महीने सरकारी पेंशन के हकदार हैं।
इलाज की गारंटी। उस्ताद जी, दमा, मिर्गी और शुगर का शर्तिया इलाज गारंटी के साथ, और पता भी लिखा है, आयुर्वेदिक दवा खाना रामगढ़। और खा गया ना कच्चा, ऐसे विज्ञापन ही तो हमें धोखा देते हैं। बिल्कुल सही, शर्तिया इलाज और चमत्कारिक दवा ये सब झूठ है। ऐसे विज्ञापन कानूनन निषेध है। ऐसे विज्ञापनों की सूचना स्टेट ड्रग लाइसेंसिंग अथॉरिटी को देनी चाहिए।
ड्रग्स और मैजिक रेमेडीज ऑब्जेक्शनेबल एडवर्टाइजमेंट एक्ट 1954 का उल्लंघन करने पर जुर्माना, सजा या फिर दोनों भी हो सकते हैं।
मैं तो समझ गया, और आप?
महात्मा गांधी नरेगा में रोजगार के लिए आवेदन किसको?
पंचायत को।
गांव में काम करवाने की जिम्मेदारी किसकी?
पंचायत की।
गांव में कहाँ काम होगा, क्या काम होगा, ये तय कौन करेगा?
ग्राम सभा।
सोशल ऑडिट की जिम्मेदारी किसकी?
ग्राम सभा।
मैं हूँ इस गांव की सरपंच। रोजगार गारंटी से जुड़ी पंचायत और ग्राम सभा की जिम्मेदारियों को मैंने ठीक से समझा है, और आपने?
मैंने वचन दिया है, वादा किया है
कि वो 7 दिन गाँव के हर जच्चा बच्चा का
पूरा ख्याल रखूंगी। प्रसव के बाद के 7 दिन बहुत नाजुक होते हैं। इन 7 दिनों में जच्चा बच्चा को कोई भी परेशानी हो, कमजोरी या सांस फूलना, तेज बुखार इत्यादि, तो सीधा स्वास्थ्य केंद्र में ले आए। देर करना जानलेवा हो सकता है। इन सब में तो वो 7 दिन की शपथ ले ली। आप भी लीजिए। अगर जच्चा बच्चा से है प्यार, तो वो 7 दिन में रखो पूरा ख्याल।
Public Forum today, a discussion on the performance of Indian economy this year. Yes, there was some growth in terms of the growth that we witnessed in various sectors, which we were talking about before going into the break. But most important concern that remained for the government as well as for the common man was the growth momentum of the economy being hit by price rise, problem of inflation. Dr. Das, you were talking about the price rise issue that had an adverse impact both on the economy as well as generally even on the common man. How do you look at that threatening the entire process and destabilizing the economy at some point of time?
No, definitely it's a cause of concern, and from the consumer's point of view, it is definitely a major problem. But from the producer's point of view, if we do not have the problem of middlemen or the traders actually taking away the margins, then price rise is something good for the producers, and be it in manufacturing or agriculture. And that's the point that I was mentioning, that perhaps this increase in agricultural growth in recent times is also partly due to the fact that whatsoever little increases that agricultural producers would have got in terms of their produce would have been counted in their increased incomes, and therefore agriculture's GDP income growth. So in that sense, we have to see it in a very balanced way. But all these producers are at some point also consumers. We have to understand that. So on balance, inflation definitely causes a problem if it is unchecked. But we have not been able to figure out at what point of time and in what context what is the ideal level of inflation that is actually growth stimulating.
You think that this was the huge concern throughout this year? Inflation figures rising up to double-digit numbers, especially the high food prices. Do you think remained a huge concern, and somewhere the government's efforts were not sufficient to meet the crisis?
Certainly, I mean, I would agree with Dr. Das that the terms of trade had moved against agriculture from 1999 to 2004. So if the prices are moving in favor of agriculture prices growing faster, one can understand, saying that, well, in fact, our Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission also said that terms of trade is being corrected. But two caveats. One is what Dr. Das mentioned. If the benefits are not going to the producer and taken by the middleman, then of course this correction of terms of trade doesn't mean anything. And secondly, if the food prices are increasing, do we have a system to protect the unorganized sector, both in the rural and urban areas? If you are not able to do that, if you think that, well, agricultural prices should go up and that would help the farmers, that is certainly not correct. And finally, I would like to mention in this context one point, that the short-run increases in the prices of onions and in the prices of vegetables, including tomato, in sugar also, I mean, that is certainly not linked with these terms of trade or even the weather conditions. It's basically because of hoarding. And I think our Minister for Agriculture making a statement that it will take 2-3 weeks for the onion prices to come down, it really, in a way, indirectly helps the hoarders, it gives a justification for them to hoard. So certainly that's a mismanagement of the, certainly vegetables and the food as a whole, the short-term fluctuation.
Okay. There was also a broad comparison with the international crude oil prices. They were rising, and then there were impact on the inflation figures in our country. How to look at all these things finally having an impact on our economy? Throughout this year, we saw a lot of ups and downs.
See, I tend to believe that a fast-growing economy will also be, inflationary to an extent. Certain amount of inflation would be inevitable. It's inflation is one is a political and a social question, and the other is an economic imperative. So we have to look at it, separately. The two.
They are not interconnected.
They are interconnected. They tend to get interconnected in a democracy like ours.
Right.
But one has to, what is the inflation that we are talking about? We are talking about a 10% inflation. Of course, we are talking about food inflation that we've had, 15%, 16%, and even more.
Right.
At the peak, it's been 18%. Now, that is of course unacceptable level of food inflation. But if you look at the history, we've had a fairly high degree of inflation, except say 5-6 years of high growth and low inflation. That we had. So we've got used to a certain benchmark now. We don't have a concept of a threshold inflation level. But now there seems to be a psychological level of, say 5% inflation on the wholesale price index is what is acceptable. Beyond that, it becomes high inflation. So these are all psychological, political questions actually.
Right.
What is
but does it have a direct implication on the growth percentage, on the growth on the performance?
I was just looking at the global thing. Now look at China. China has had very high growth with high inflation. So if India actually has, that's a developing model which is not exceptional. And these things about government doing something about containing prices and all that, unless you are talking about rationing and price control and things like that, in a market economy, that's very little that the government can do about it. This bout of inflation that we have had has been primarily because of supply shortages. Be they in food, you've had a drought year, you've had bad production. Before that, you had international food prices which were high because grain was getting diverted into alternate fuel, for instance. That is because oil prices were high at $150, $146 a barrel was the peak before the crisis. Now that being the case, there is very little that by way of policy leverage that you can do at a macro level to control inflation. So it's been an unending fight. So it has to be a political thing.
Right, but accordingly, if you look at it globally, Asian markets have been looked upon by the West as the best place to invest and have trade contacts with these nations. Like, let us say there has been some sort of significant increase in the FII inflows, but FDIs remain an area where we were not able to achieve something that probably is required to boost the country's economy. How do you look at all these things contributing to our growth story?
No, again, I'll just answer, but one very important aspect that Mr. Das mentioned. In our society or in our economy, we have a basic contradiction. We want increased role of market and less intervention from the government. But when there is inflation, the market looks up to the government. Now, this contradiction needs to be understood. That when you are actually providing space for producers and consumers to actually determine their production scale and sell at price which they want to, then if the prices are rising, you cannot look up to government all the time.
But how do you look at the government's measures this time to cope with inflation?
No, I think government was very quick. They, for instance, in recent times, if you just see, 2 weeks back, the kind of measures that were taken in terms of investigating what are the causes, if there is any hoarding, export ban, immediate measures to import, some of the products. And this has been the case. It is not the first time. In fact, we have had worse inflationary pressures. When it
one cannot ignore the politics of all these things playing a very spoil sport here. But let us come back to the same point. That is the increase of. Let us here understand how FIIs and FDIs can really contribute to can really boost the economy. Dr. Das.
Yes. You see, FDI is an investment where you actually go. Set up a plant, there is a manufacturing unit or a service unit, and you employ people, you bring technology, you bring know-how, and start producing either manufacturing output or a service output. Whereas FIIs are not contributing directly to what is called as gross domestic capital formation. It doesn't contribute to investment, quote unquote. They come, they are mostly for the speculative purposes. They make money, and when they want to go, they go away. So that is why there have been talk of Tobin tax and and transaction tax in the stock market when foreign capital comes and goes. Each time it goes out, you should tax it so that it becomes a detriment to taking the money out. So in that sense, FIIs and FDI are very different in nature. And but there has also been talks, that FDI, there is a portion of FDI which is also in essential way an FII, but it is being brought in as an FDI. But those are exceptional cases. So our focus, and it has been a very cautious and deliberate approach to attract foreign direct investment, and that is why if you see we have been one of the preferred destinations. At the same time, we have had a very cautious approach towards FIIs also, because we do not have the kind of flexibility of our capital account that many other countries have, and that is why we were not, our foreign exchange reserves did not dwindle immediately when there was a liquidity crunch in the West. It didn't go out immediately. So in that sense, your point is correct that it was in Asia, various countries, those who used to be very important FDI destination and recipients could not perform to the extent that they used to, and actually India became a much more preferred destination.
Right, but our approach towards these such investments is quite different as compared to China. What is that approach, and how are the two economies trying to build a new world order now? We'll discuss on this. Time for a very short break. फानुस बनके जिसकी हिफाजत हवा करे, वो शमा क्या बुझे जिसे रोशन खुदा करे। ये पहल है उनके नाम जिन्हें विश्वास है खुद पर, जिन्हें नाज है अपने सपनों पर, जिन्होंने अपनी तदबीर से अपनी तकदीर बदल दी। ऐसे ही मजबूत इरादों की दास्तां, हौसलों की राह।
हमारे लिए सबसे कीमती कौन है? हमारे कस्टमर। ध्यान रहे, आज का ग्राहक पूरी तरह जागरूक है। अगर ग्राहक किसी प्रोडक्ट या ब्रांड के बारे में पूछताछ करता है, उसे सही और पूरी जानकारी दें। खरीद के बाद अगर ग्राहक को कोई कंप्लेंट है, तो तुरंत उसका समाधान करें।
याद रहे, नाराज ग्राहक कंज्यूमर कोर्ट भी जा सकता है और फिर ग्राहक की संतुष्टि दुकानदार का फर्ज है। पहले ग्राहक जागा, अब विक्रेता की बारी है। उपभोक्ता जागरण, जिम्मेदारी हमारी है।
कल हमारा है। जल का संरक्षण कर हमने अपने गांव की सूखी भूमि को संवारा है। कल हमारा है। अब होगी उन्नत खेती, पशुओं को मिलेगा चारा, रोजगार के मिलेंगे अवसर सभी को, घर घर लौटेंगी खुशियां। ये प्रण हमारा है, क्योंकि कल हमारा है।
Welcome back to Public Forum. In Public Forum today, a discussion on the performance of Indian economy this year. Right, And for our viewers, our toll-free numbers are, toll-free lines are now open for you. You can call us on our toll-free numbers, which are 1-800-115313 and 1-800-115314. Well, before going into the break, Mr. Dash, we were talking about the FIIs and the FDIs and they having an impact on the economy. Why are we not attracting FDIs to that extent? Many would say that probably it's because of the market strategy we have, which is very different from what China has employed. Do you think that it is time that we should think of some sort of, let's say, revision in our market strategy, make it more open? We can't be an open market altogether, but how can we really go about it?
See, the money will come into markets that are growing. So, since India is one of the first growing economies of the world, money will come in. Whether they come in terms of FII investment or FDI investment, money has no color in that sense. And they will stay here even if they are FII investment coming into the stock market.
No.
They tend to stay here if conditions here can keep those investments. And that's been proven during the crisis that there was no precipitate withdrawal of these investments. So this hot money concept is a concept that is relative. It relative to the conditions that one is talking about. Now in India is an attractive investment destination, one of the most attractive in the world. So there is no doubt about it. Why is FDI not coming to the extent that FII is flowing in? I would say the problem is not so much with the FDI policy, which is already pretty liberalized.
Right.
It is with the implementation of projects. We have a problem in quickly implementing FDI projects. So there are problems with clearances, approvals, with land, with raw material supply, with linkages, with infrastructure. So these are the issues, because FDI is something unlike a financial investment which is made in the stock market.
Right.
The foreign investor can send that money and get invested in an existing stock. But in a greenfield project where FDI is where actual investment getting into the ground, you need to have those conditions right, which unfortunately is not the case.
Right.
That is the reason I can see why FDI flow, the pace of growth is slower compared to what you are getting on the FII side.
Right. We are now joined by a caller from Delhi, Mr. Prem Kumar. Please put your question.
Hello.
Hanji, kahiye. Mr. Kumar, can you please repeat your question? Well, I guess there is some problem with the phone line there. We'll try to get back to him again. But looking at these, the kind of economy we have, Dr. Kundu, what do you think are the possibilities now to actually retain the kind of status that India has achieved now? We heard President Barack Obama, he called India as a country which has already arrived. We are no longer developing economies, we have already emerged as an economy. Do you think that there's a tough competition lying ahead for India from countries, from another emerging economy like China?
Well, certainly sustainability of this high growth rate is going to be a problem both for India as well as China. I mean, I really don't think that we should always look at China as a competitor. Of course, in certain areas they are. But if you want to sustain this growth rate, you have to have a high growth rate in effective demand. And unless you have a fair distribution of this growth across different sections of the population, the sustainability of growth will be a major issue. And I do believe that the growth in the real income in the unorganized sector is not taking place. I understand there is some kind of hopelessness on the part of the government in controlling the prices. Both Dr. Das and Dr. Das did mention. And that's why inflation is coming up, because we have allowed in the last 4 or 5 years our food prices to be linked with the global prices. I understand that. But what happens as a result? The private expenditure on health, education goes down. I have no doubt that in terms of poverty, Millennium Development Goals, India is on the target. We are going to reduce it by 2015 to half. But as far as our infant mortality rate is concerned, as far as maternal mortality rate is concerned, gender equity is concerned, India is going to have a sharp deficit. And so is the problem with China also in some of the sectors. So I would think that instead of putting the competition in terms of growth, let's also look at some of the social dimensions. Are we meeting the social target? That should be our major.
There comes the question of growth versus development.
Absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely.
striking a balance between the two things.
Absolutely.
One of the important things here is that we've also heard reports by UNCTAD which said that Indian economy grew at a rate of 8% in 2010. That is how we can suppose it now. But its employment sector has not really recovered yet from the financial crisis. You think more job creation is something which we require at this point in our country?
Well, we do not have as yet the firm employment data from the large sample of National Sample Survey analysis. But nonetheless, I would accept that the employment growth has not been as fast as it has been, let's say, in the in the early part of this decade. But nonetheless, to some extent, NREGA has compensated in the rural areas by creating this job. But the sustainability of such a program is also in question. And unless the unorganized sector grows not only in terms of employment, but in terms of decent employment, gives them reasonable social security and reasonable wages, I think that is a problem. I'm not that much worried about annual fluctuations in the employment growth rate, but covering the unorganized sector through social security, as was proposed by the Arjun Sen Gupta committee. And that should be our major agenda in the next 4 or 5 years of the present plan.
Okay. Mr. Dash, here are some very important things, because this year we also saw a lot of mergers and acquisitions, deal worth $67.2 billion, and more of them in the sectors of energy, power, telecom, pharma. Really, accounted for almost 65% of the total deal value. Do you think that these are the new areas which other countries are also looking up to the moment they come and, they deal with India or Indian companies here?
Yes, of course. These are all segments which are the future segments of the economy, and these are the segments where the action is. So naturally, what we have seen is business. This is the business cycle which is turning, and so we've had both global and Indian, global recession and Indian slowdown, and after that you've now had the situation coming back to its normal in terms of merger and acquisition as businesses look out to consolidate. So this is a trend that is going to, going into 2011, 2012, is going to further solidify.
Okay.
And these are the areas where actually the merger and acquisitions will be sharper, faster.
We've also seen IT industry, which has really marked, there has been a revival of the IT industry with 2010 this year, almost $60 billion of sort of revival in this industry. But looking at it, it was also expected that this will boost the employment sector in a year's time. Dr. Das, can we expect a lot from this sector personally? Because we were just talking about the employment recovery which is required in the country.
Yes. Again, let me just refer to the mergers and acquisitions. You see, mergers and acquisitions have to be seen in a very balanced perspective. Because when foreign direct investment, a foreign company comes and it merges with a local company or 100% acquires the local company, then definitely FDI has come in to your domestic economy. But whether this is the kind of FDI we want, where foreign companies either are, taking over the domestic companies or not. But, ethically we would feel that no, this should not happen. But what dilemma Indian economy faces today is that, on the contrary, there are Indian outward investors going to other countries and also acquiring assets, buying companies. So, On this, what kind of balanced approach is required? That is a major challenge, a development challenge in my view. Now, coming back to this question of IT, IT is something where we have a comparative advantage, and this is where the international dimension of our development cooperation framework comes in. And there are n number of developing countries, both in our immediate neighborhood, in our extended neighborhood, who are actually IT deficient. And here we have IT, comparative advantage. In that sense, I would say that cooperation between India and various other countries that are actually in the crying need of IT and IT-related infrastructure, the digital divide, it is another kind of inequality. There, India's, international cooperation on commercial terms can be again something which can contribute to expansion of job creation in this sector, and this can become a many, multi, in fact, billion, tens of billions, sector in the times to come.
Right, and very, very quickly, if we just talk about one more important area, which remains an area of concern, that is the trade deficit that we have with the various countries. Now, this was the time when we saw the P5 nations visiting us, signing those bilateral agreements. We have good trade relations, even with an economy like China. We are going to touch almost $60 billion there. But look at the trade deficit. Does it remain a huge, huge concern which the government will have to focus on in the next year?
No, to the contrary. It's not. It's actually proving to be a blessing this year. As you can see, there is concern about in certain quarters about capital inflows. We are talking about FIs inflows, FDI inflows, and all that. Now there is concern because of the inflation being high. After all, this money coming in from outside it creates more supply of money internally, and creates pressure on inflation. So that being the case, there are concern about capital inflows. But you see, this the trade deficit that we have this year is actually helping us absorb a lot of these capital inflows. Some of the other countries, Brazil, several of those countries have been concerned about their capital inflows and have taken steps to restrict those capital inflows. We do not require to do that because we have a large trade gap. So our trade gap that we have is getting financed to an extent by the inflows, and so the trade gap actually has been good. Now you talked about our trade gap vis-a-vis country like China, for instance. There again, it is not a matter of concern at all. Actually, it's a good thing. It's in the sense that what are we importing from China? We are importing telecom equipment, power equipment, infrastructural things that we are investing in, and we are getting them cheap comparatively. So if we have a trade gap with China, that gap in normal prices would be perhaps, depending on to the extent that the Chinese currency is undervalued, to the extent that it is undervalued, to that extent, in reality, this trade gap would have been huge. So the trade gap with China is actually to an extent financing our development, and we are doing that cheaper than we would do. Now, it's another thing to say that we should be exporting more to China. And we land up exporting only iron ore and steel, which is
there are certain other challenges also that lies ahead. In the last segment of Public Forum, we'll discuss about it. Stay tuned.
A musician and a rapper.
बहन जी, रोशनी की माँ और पिता आए हैं।
जी नमस्ते।
नमस्ते। रोशनी की पढ़ाई अच्छी चल रही है। आजकल मैं उसे गणित में जोड़ और घटाने के सवालों का खूब अभ्यास करा रही हूँ। बहनजी सवाल हो गए। रोशनी की कॉपी तो देखिए, कल 10 में से 8 सवाल ठीक थे, आज सारे 10 के 10 ठीक हैं। शाबाश रोशनी, शाबाश रोशनी।
नरेश जी, आपने अपनी शिकायत दर्ज करवाई? लिख तो ली है, पर इसका ऑफिस कहाँ है? ये तो मुझे भी नहीं पता।
अंकल लीजिए कंज्यूमर फॉर्म का पता।
पता? तुम्हें कहाँ से मिला?
अंकल आपको देश में किसी भी स्थान पर से उपभोक्ता फॉर्म का पता जानना हो तो लॉग इन कीजिए www.ncdrc.nic.in या कंज्यूमर हेल्पलाइन 1800114000 पर कॉल करें।
अरे ये तो बहुत ही आसान है, आप भी कर सकते हैं। जागो ग्राहक जागो।
कल हमारा है। जल का संरक्षण कर हमने अपने गांव की सूखी भूमि को संवारा है। कल हमारा है। अब होगी उन्नत खेती, पशुओं को मिलेगा चारा, रोजगार के मिलेंगे अवसर सभी को, घर घर लौटेंगी खुशियां। ये प्रण हमारा है, क्योंकि कल हमारा है।
Right, welcome back to Public Forum. In Public Forum today, a discussion on the state of Indian economy. Well, it has been said by those economic analysts so far that fiscal discipline, deficit reduction remains one important area where the government will have to keep its focus entirely on. We have seen, Dr. Kundu, that had been one of the targets of the government to reduce the fiscal deficit, although this time through the 2G auction, a lot of revenue was generated, and probably due to this, the deficit could have been contained. But how do you look at the sustained efforts being made by the government from various things, and how do you look at these trade, having an impact now on the domestic economy?
You see, although Dr. Das mentioned that one shouldn't be terribly worried about the deficit, but I know that there is excitement in the Ministry of Trade that our trade with the European Union is growing and we have surplus there, whereas with the United States we have deficits and there is a fall. So I have a feeling that trade surplus with certain countries would help in getting the investments and also some of the critical inputs in certain sectors. As far as the overall deficit in the budget is concerned, well, 3G has given only 70,000 crores, whereas we are hearing 1.75 thousand crores being lost.
Right.
So certainly it's a big setback, and I believe that certainly controlling inflation should be a major concern. Promoting growth is there, but nonetheless there are social sectors.
These scams have had an impact,
absolutely,
adverse impact.
Absolutely, I would agree. And I'll tell you, last week, one cabinet minister had an interesting formulation. He was candidly sharing. He said that, when the economy is growing at 9%, the black economy also grows at 9%. And there are all kinds of opportunities of corruption which gets created. And the institutions and the legal system that we have created was created in a phase of low economic growth. And suddenly the high economic growth scenario comes, the old institutions cannot take care of it. I personally believe that this scam, the way it has come up, which has made so much of loss to the revenue of the government, they were pointed out by the existing legal system, existing institution, Ministry of Law, Ministry of Finance, AI, they did give the warning and still we didn't listen. So basically I think it is the coalition politics of the present government which could not really take strong measures to some of their partners.
Dr. Das, we are here talking about a very crucial sector, the telecom sector. Do you think that more regulation would be something that would be high on the government's agenda next year and maybe deal with the crisis?
Well, I'm not a political scientist, but I guess regulation is not an answer to check corruption in any case. Corruption is something which is there in somebody who does not earn. He has a different motivation to earn more, and somebody who has earned more has a different motivation to earn more. So I guess it's very difficult to understand the psychology and the way people go about these very negative things in any society. It happens in developing country, it happens in developed country, and you cannot justify this trade. So I guess the solution to this would be to have leaders who have high values rather than policies and regulations that can possibly contain. So perhaps growth combined with employment can result in development. That will have to be combined with the ethos, the cultural and social ethos for which Indian civilization is known for. I think this package, if our leaders demonstrate, it will have, it will percolate. Because if you go by some cross-section analysis, you would find at a lower income level, the corruption is less than at the higher level. Right. So I think the ethos and the safety of that ethos is more in the common man than else.
But more, what do you think are going to be the focus areas this time in the next year? I mean, we're talking about the sectors here, we're talking about the areas.
The government borrowings, that certainly is an area that has to be brought back on track. After you've had, there was a certain stage in the economy that required government to overspend and to borrow and spend. It required to provide the stimulus to the economy, so that was done. Now you have to get back to a more normal way of government spending and borrowing. Because if the government keeps borrowing such huge amount of money, that will be crowding out private borrowers like you and me from the market. You'll have pressure on the interest rate, so we can't borrow. Private businesses can't borrow. Corporate sector cannot borrow. Which is the case. So the government has to cut down its borrowing, and it has a program. And fortunately, this year, since the growth has revived, so revenues have been buoyant, and even with or without the 3G auction, government's budget is on track, and they are going to meet the deficit targets. So they will be not borrowing more than that they had budgeted.
Big tax reforms also on the card?
Yes, big tax reforms are on the card. They have been on the card for some time. Right. But they, unfortunately, actually they have been delayed to an extent, both on the direct tax, that is on the income tax side, and on the goods and services tax. The direct tax bill is there, and it is coming into force from April 1st, 2012. So that we have a roadmap. On the goods and services tax, however, which is a really major tax reforms and can do wonders to this economy, particularly creating a common market in this country. That we still do not have a certain roadmap as to where we are headed and how we are going to reach there. Right. So there is still a need for a grand bargain to be done between the centre and the states and among states to arrive at this kind of a thing.
Right. Apart from this domestic management, Dr. Das, energy, economy, we're talking about energy, environment. Do you think that these are the issues that would be testing the might of these emerging economies here?
This was very important, and I'm very glad that you pointed out, because again, if you link, if you take the issue of trade deficit, India's overall trade deficit is largely determined by the oil imports, right? And therefore, at any point of time, if we want to contain the deleterious effects of trade deficit, you will have to look at the energy security. And inextricably linked to energy security is the climate change negotiation. Right. So this is going to be really challenging. On one hand, we as a country cannot say that we don't want a safer and greener environment when in the course of development. But at the same time, we have to see whether we can afford the cost of a safer and greener environment at this stage of development. Now, this tension in terms of our capacity to do what we should be doing is going to be a major challenge for a country like India.
Okay, and we did not really talk about the infrastructure sector, but we all know that a lot of investment and attention is required in that sector. Dr. Kundu?
Certainly, I mean, infrastructural investment is important, but what is important is that the leakages in many of our flagship programs which have been documented, that has to be stopped. Otherwise, the infrastructural investment per se doesn't really bring about regional development or rural development. Talking about climatic change, I must tell you, I looked at some of the maps prepared on vulnerable regions, basically linked with rainfall, and agriculture is going to be affected. So I looked at the map prepared by Terry also. And then I superimposed the map at the district level of poverty. You find these two are coinciding. So I believe that if the government of India has to take up the challenge of dealing with the problem of vulnerability in respect to climatic change, it has to address its strategy towards the poverty pockets that I mentioned right in the beginning. I believe that for the next 4 to 5 years, attacking poverty and attacking the problems of climatic change vulnerability are going to be similar in nature for at least next 4 to 5 years.
Okay, on that note, it's time here to say goodbye to you all. Thanks very much, everyone, for speaking to us. The mood seems to be upbeat, but a dose of realism never did any harm. On that note, we sign off in public forum. Thanks very much. Good night.